The Gill family's ancestors were among Canton's earliest settlers. Don Gill's dairy farm was owned as a family partnership and at present is owned and operated by his nephew Tom Gill and his wife Sherry. It is one of Canton's oldest farms. Don, let's begin with a little background on your family's history.
Well, my great-grandfather Peter Gill came to this area from Howell, and my grandfather that came with him at the time was 9 years old. And since then, the farm has been in the family and has continuously farmed since 1883. We've added some acres as time has gone by, but the basic farm is still there.
You have other relatives in the area too. There were two brothers originally who settled here, correct? So there are some.
I'm not sure who the other Gills are that are in the cemetery. They tell me there. I know there's some there, but when I was young enough that I could have talked with my grandfather and grandmother, why I didn't ask them how they were related to us. So whether he came down because of a brother or a cousin or who was here, there apparently were Gills here before he came.
Your farm actually straddles the boundary of two counties.
That's correct. There's about 100 acres of the original farm in Canton Township and about 70 that are in Washtenaw County. And the house that my wife and I live in at the present time is divided by the county line. The back of our house is in Washtenaw County and the front of our house is in Canton, in Wayne County, Canton Township.
Tell me about farming and how it's changed over the years.
Well, it's changed a lot. I can remember when I was a boy growing up, they had general farming then, and my parents and my dad and grandfather farmed together. They had about 19 dairy cows that they milked, and a few steers, 5 or 6, and maybe 40 sheep, and probably 25 or 30 hogs. And then they had 4 horses that they used to do a lot of the farm work. And since then, it's just been a gradual change. The biggest change started coming just before World War II, when farmers were starting to mechanize. But at that time, the tractors had steel wheels, so it made it more difficult to transport them on the road. And so they were coming into use, but still there were few horses being used before World War II. But after the war, rubber tires for tractors had been invented, and companies switched from making war goods into making farm machinery, and so they made much new farm machinery that made it so a farmer could handle much more acreage with one man. When I was a boy, if a man had 40 to 80 acres per man, it was considered a relatively large farm. But now a man to make a living, especially if he's only a cash crop and not in a specialized farming of market products or vegetables and so forth, would have to have probably close to 800 or 1,000 acres. So there's been quite a dramatic change by the fact that large machinery allows one man to do so much more. After my father passed away in 1957, and I'd been in partnership with him, and at that time we'd increased, so we were milking about 60 cows more or less, and we'd eliminated the hogs, the sheep, and the horses, and so we were strictly a specialized dairy farm. And then when my brother got out of service in 1955, he came into the partnership with my father and I, and we started increasing a little bit. We probably got up to maybe 70 cows or so, but they were all kept in a stanchion barn. That means whenever the cows weren't out in the pasture, in the summertime or all during the winter, they were kept confined to their special stall in the barn all the time, other than you let them out for a little bit of exercise. My father passed away in 57, and my brother and I realized that we did not own any farmland, and if we wanted to continue to farm, we had to start making some thoughts on what we wanted to do. So we worked with the Extension Service and the Soil Conservation Service, and they told us by making a farm plan and so forth that we could expand our dairy operation and probably still continue to afford to stay in Canton Township. So after that we started growing so that we had gotten up to about 450 cows before I retired from the partnership. And during that change, most of it came because we had what we called a milking parlor, and 2 men could milk in the milking parlor and milk 80 cows an hour, where if we were in the stanchion barn, they probably wouldn't be able to do half that many. It speeded up the milking process. When I was a boy, all milk went into 10-gallon milk cans, and so the weight of the can and the milk weight made it weigh about 100 to 110 pounds. That milk was delivered to a creamery, which I'll go into a little more detail when I'm telling you about the history of Cherry Hill Village. And then when we built the milking parlor, well, we started handling the milk in the bulk tank, so that it was the trailer came and pumped the milk out of the tank once a day or every 2 days when we first started, because the tank had room to hold 2 days. So that made a lot less handling, and so 1 or 2 men could handle many more cows. Then we got so you weren't feeding the cow as an individual. You would add augers that would auger the feed down the feed bunk right from the silo, and so that enabled us to take care of more head. So that's been one of the biggest changes. And as far as the cattle are concerned, when I was a boy, if a farmer said he was getting 10,000 pounds of milk from a cow, you would say he had a very good herd average. Many farmers were only getting 7,000 or 8,000 pounds a year from a cow. Now, unless you're getting 22,000 to 28,000 pounds per cow, why people think you aren't doing a very good job in being able to produce milk efficiently. A lot of that was caused because of artificial insemination. By using that, the semen from a bull could be diluted so that a very good bull could become a father to many more calves than he would have if used in natural service. And they were able to use the records and figure out which bulls would be the best, and that way you were able to improve your herd for milk production or their feet or legs or anything that was a weakness in that cow, why you could breed to improve it. So that has helped a great deal. And then also the veterinarians had learned how to use sterility drugs to help cows get straightened around from having their calves and getting conceived again. And so that made it, by using pregnancy checks and checking the cows, you were able to get them bred back more regularly. In fact, the university hospital doctors wouldn't want to have it told on them, but they contacted our veterinarian when they were first thinking of using drugs, sterility drugs for women, because he'd had more experience on how the female cows would respond to various ones, and so they were interested on what background he could give them on it. Also, another thing that's changed farming is we have hybrid seed corn. When I was a boy, my grandfather and dad would cut the corn and stack it in shocks out in the field, and then they'd go out and husk it. If they found a very good ear they thought looked nice, they would take it up overhead in the shop, and they had a 2x4 hanging from a wire so the mice couldn't get to it, and with many finishing nails driven in it, and they would stick the ear of corn on that nail so that it could dry, and then next spring they would shell it and use it for seed. But with the hybrid corn being developed, well, you could get so much more yield and consistent yield from it, increased corn. And then with the machinery that harvested it when I was young, why, all of it was done by hand. And with first corn pickers started as 1 row and then 2 row, and then they got up to 3 row corn pickers. And now the combines that harvest the corn, why, they've gone from 2 to 3 to 6 to 8, and there are some 12 row in some parts of the country where the fields are larger. I think that covers a lot of the changes that I've seen in farming, and we'll move on to some other segment of it.
You have a lot of good memories of Cherry Hill as a community and as a school. What do you remember about that?
Well, I can remember Cherry Hill as I was a goat with my father when he took his cans of milk to the creamery. There was a creamery on the southwest corner of South Ridge and Cherry Hill Road, and that milk used to be brought in cans, and they would set the cans up into the receivers, and they would dump the milk into a tank. All the cans from that one farmer were dumped into a tank, and then it was weighed and recorded, and that's what you were paid for. And then they would run that milk over an aerator from that they used to cool the milk if it was a little bit warm, that they were pumping from a well on the site. and then the milk would go out into a bulk truck that was outside that they took into Detroit so they could pasteurize it. I remember it especially because the truck that they were using at the time was even old for my time. It had a chain drive, had side curtains on it, and had hard rubber tires. And so as a kid, where everything I'd seen was on balloon tires, why it seemed rather strange to me that you didn't see other trucks like that. The creamery apparently didn't put enough miles on, so they were still using that type of a truck. These milk cans would then go into a can washer. They used steam and soap and so forth to cleanse it. And then after it drained, why the can washer would turn it back right side up and send it out on rollers, and the farmer would pick up his milk cans and take them home. Some of the milk came from as far away as Dexter that came to this receiving station. It was brought in large trucks that would maybe haul 80 or 90 cans of milk with it. Those farmers that had their milk brought that way had to have 2 sets of cans. When the man picked up their milk one day, he left them the clean cans from the day before, so that he had to only make 1 trip each day to the farm. I also remember other parts of Cherry Hill. There's been very few houses built in Cherry Hill. Actually, if you analyze Cherry Hill from 70 years ago, why there's only been probably enough, not more than 4 or 5 new homes built in the area that we call the historic area of Cherry Hill. Very little building. Most of the houses look a lot like they did at the time. There used to be West General Store that was on the southeast corner of Ridge and Cherry Hill Road. That, at the time, it was a general store, and they sold everything from food to shoes to nails, bolts, hardware. It was just about anything. The farmers, after they had delivered their milk, would come into the store and buy whatever they needed, a new pair of shoes, a new pair of boots, or perhaps some nails, and take them home with them. And so it got so it was kind of a social gathering place in the back of the store around the stove in the hardware part. There could be up to 8 or 10 farmers in there talking for a short time each morning as they brought their milk in. And then overhead of this west store, there was a dance hall. And I can remember going there as a kid with my folks when they were dances. And I am told it was before my time that was used as a community hall too. They would have community dinners and get-togethers there. And my mother's told me that they had no running water there. They carried all of the water they needed for those things in milk cans up the stairs to get there. And as a kid, when you were downstairs, when they were dancing upstairs, you could hear the floor keeping time with the music. It was squeak and groan as the people were dancing. And so these are things that I can remember as a boy being there. And they also sold gasoline at West General Store. And then there was the Dunstan Garage. Both of the gas pumps, he had a gas pump also at the Dunstan Garage. They were the old-fashioned hand pump. You'd pump up 10 gallons into the glass container at the top, and then gravity would feed it into the car. And if you could use 7 gallons, why, they'd say you'd see that they put 7 gallons in and you'd pay them. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was 7 gallons for $1 about that time. So it was quite a change in what it was worth. At Dunstan Garage, he also did some repair work on vehicles, and my father took things to him as a blacksmith while he could bend them or mend them or repair them some. And then on the east side of Cherry Hill Village, there was a sawmill that was run by Ambrose Dunstan and James Burrow. They had an oil pull tractor that ran the sawmill. Farmers would bring their logs and they would saw them into lumber for them to make different things. There was an old standard joke that they said that was a sawmill that could make the most wagon tongues out of anything they took in, because the saw tended not to be too accurate, so it might start out 2 inches at one end and be 1 inch on the other end, or 3 inches. You never quite knew. Sometimes it was that way. And so it was kind of a joke. And I can remember as a boy out playing at recess, where you could hear the oil pull tractor running, putting along, and the whine of the saw as it was sawing through the logs. I also have some memories of Cherry Hill School. I brought some pictures. This is a picture of probably taken at about 1930 or 31, I had Miss Elda Fisher was our teacher, and you can see that the school is a little bit smaller class than we'll get into as we get farther on in this. This is another picture taken with Miss Fisher. Probably was taken 2 or 3 years later. And then I have a picture that was taken when I was about probably in the middle of my schooling time with Miss Ruth Love was our teacher. And you can see we're getting up close to 40 boys and girls were attending at that time. And then this is another one that was taken when I was probably about in the 6th or 7th grade, showing the size of our class, and our teacher was Miss Hutchins at the time. And she married, and all of us were invited to her wedding, and she became Mrs. Walton. And it was an evening wedding, so I can remember going as a boy. That was a little out of the ordinary for us to do. And we used to have a great time in school. There was a big furnace in one corner of the school, a big black furnace, and it had to have coal in order to use it. And we would go sliding in the wintertime, and every recess and noon while everybody came in with wet boots and wet mittens, and so the furnace was lined all around it with wet boots and mittens that were drying. The desks were mounted on 2x4s so that they could be slid into rows, or they could be slid to one side so that we could have folk dancing, or if we needed a bigger area we could do different things. It was a one-room school at the time. We played many games, but one of them was pom-pom pull-away. We went sliding in the winter, and we played baseball an awful lot. And during the course of my school days, we didn't go to other schools regularly, but the younger children got out of school at 2:30, and we would go then and play competition with some of the other schools in the area, Bartlett, Hanford, Palmer, or Canton Center. We'd play a ball game with them, and a lot of the boys and girls would ride their bicycles down to the other schoolhouse, and the teacher would bring those that weren't able to have their own bikes and come, and we'd play a few innings of ball, and more as I can't remember any of the outcomes, but we had a good time while we were doing it. We had books in our school in a small library, but the county librarian came in every 6 weeks and brought us a roll of books about 6 feet long, and we were able to use those to take home and to read from them. And then you always remembered to visit because the librarian always told us a story when they brought the books, and so that was quite important to us. There were no buses. The older boys rode their bikes and girls rode their bikes. Some their parents brought them, some lived close enough in the village so they walked to school. But I, living a mile away, I rode my bike, other than when it was real cold or when I was young. Why, my parents, I rode with my father when he went to the creamery, and then I would walk from the creamery over to the schoolhouse. And the teacher in those days that not only had to have 8 or 9 different grades in her school to look after, but she was the one that was fully in charge of the janitor services. She had to build a fire and throw the coal in and carry out the ashes and do all kinds of things. And so to assist her a little bit, we had what we called a citizenship club. We organized, and we'd elect a president and a secretary, and every 2 weeks we would appoint or have volunteers for different tasks, such as cleaning the erasers, putting water in the water fountain, bringing it in from the well, carrying in the coal, or carrying out the ashes. The teacher always was the fireman on the job, but we did the legwork of helping to carry things in and out, so that did help the teachers a little bit. And I never felt that I lacked in education by the fact I went to a one-room school, because I went right from the one-room school to 9th grade in a city school, and in the city of Ypsilanti, and I never felt that it was any problem for me, other than I think the last few years my teacher didn't like English, and so we didn't have much of it, but at least we made up for it when we got in high school. I think that pretty well covers most of what I have.
Did you and your friends get into any mischief?
Oh, we used to go out trick-or-treating once in a while, or not trick-or-treating, we just go out and do devil work, like take a farmer's wagon and put it someplace. And I remember the older kids before I got there used to get something, put it up on the schoolhouse roof, and a wagon or something, and do those kind of pranks. We weren't into it quite as much, and then by the time we got old enough to know better, why it was more tricks or treat or that kind of thing that was going on.
That must have been quite an engineering feat to get a wagon on the roof of the school.
Well, you read what some of these college kids do at some of these engineering places. They do surprising things overnight. So yeah, well, I'm sure just enough of them so they could use a rope and some manpower and get it up on there. But there was some of that went on, and then we had our 4-H club and some of those things that we did.
What did you do in 4-H?
Well, I was in the Dairy Club in Washtenaw County, and I was in Handicraft Club in Wayne County. We met at the schoolhouse in the evening and had several men came and helped us. And truth of the matter, it was probably kind of hard on the desk, but we used them for our work benches to put our wood on to plane it and work on it and so forth. There was 6 or 8 of us boys that lived all within a half or 3/4 of a mile of each other. We got together on Saturdays a lot, and one place where Melissa McLaughlin lives now, there was a shed, and we used to use it for a clubhouse, and had all kinds of dreams and talks and so forth. And then we used to slide downhill. We'd get together on weekends and slide downhill over at a hill where on Proctor Road, where my nephew's house is now. They built a house there since he bought the house. Somebody else built it before that, but they took the hill we used to slide down as kids. But we used to have a lot of fun, get together and ice skate once in a while, but I never liked that because my hands and feet got so cold by the time I got there and got my skates on that I never really enjoyed it. And then I had weak ankles too, so.
Do you have any stories of Henry Ford?
Yes, my brother is the one that has the stories from Henry Ford. I was not in Cherry Hill School. I was in high school at the time. But my brother, when Henry Ford came in, he took the creamery and moved it south, and they used it for a dormitory. It's still standing there. Some people use it for a home now. And he built the factory that's there. And he brought in war veterans and people after the war and some of the wounded, and he trained them. And then they moved from there after a few months and went into some of his factories. And so that's how the factory got built on the corner where the creamery once was. My brother was young and was up riding his bike around in Cherry Hill one summer day, and saw Henry there. And Henry was adding a room onto the school, turning it into a 2-room school. And he asked my brother, "Who is your favorite teacher?" And they told him they had a man teacher a few years earlier named Sam Williams, and they really liked him. And he'd gotten married now, but they thought he was in Pennsylvania. So Henry Ford went to Pennsylvania and hired Sam Williams and his wife to come back and teach the 2-room school. And at the time, Henry Ford was connected with the Greenfield Village schools, and they would bring someone out and they taught him how to weave and do other handicraft tasks. And so they had more, and I think there was a music teacher, and so he really improved the education of things that were available for students going to Cherry Hill at the time. And while my brother was talking with the kids with Henry Ford, he got out his Jew's harp and played a little tune for him. So he was kind of just a down-homes guy, I think, from his upbringing. Even though he had money so that he could have forgotten his background, it was a pretty important part of his life. He was just a common person as far as talking with kids and enjoying life.
How has the face of the community changed visibly? How have the roads changed and the creeks?
Well, as I mentioned, when we used to play these other schools' baseball, we rode on the roads with our bicycle. But you want to remember, the roads in Canton have basically changed very little, other than a few more have been hard surfaced, and Ford Road has been widened. But basically, we had the same 2-lane roads back then, and so traffic was relatively small, light, compared to what we think of Canton as being nowadays.
I've heard that the creeks were big enough to actually navigate raft stuff. Do you remember them being?
No, the creek that ran in from underneath Cherry Hill Road in Cherry Hill and goes south and then cuts and down by Proctor Road. Just north of Proctor Road it cuts and goes to the Rouge. It had more water in because at the time the dairy was there, they pumped great amounts of water in and cooling the milk and washing up the equipment. And in those days you could just discharge it right back into the creek again. And so I think that kept that creek larger. A lot of the creeks have dried up, I think, because, well, there's more cropping that soaks up the water and it doesn't run to the creek. When we had a lot of pastures back when I was a boy and in early farming. That's another change that came to farming, is people went from running the cattle out in the field to bringing all of the food into the cows and keeping them in a dry lot, because you could harvest the forage and crops when they were in ideal condition and preserve them and fed them. And if you turn cows loose with the soiling that the cows do with the urine and so forth, why they not only wasted a lot with their feet and soiling it, why you didn't get near the maximum amount of the crop harvested that way. And so this was just another change that had to come about in order to stay in Canton Township longer. That was one of the reasons we continued to dairy in Canton Township, is the fact that it was cost us less to get our milk hauled to the dairy by the fact we were close to the dairies that were processing it. We used to take our milk to the creamery till about 1940, and then they decided they were going to close the local creameries up, and they took the cans of milk into Detroit. And so for a few years, we had to have 2 sets of cans, and then they came and then the truck hauled our cans of milk into Detroit. And then when we decided to go bulk, a lot of farmers were doing it at the same time, and so it put the can truck operator out of business. He had to have a trailer with a pump on it so he could back up and hook his hose onto the tank, and then they hauled the milk to Detroit in the bulk form, and then it was transferred into the bulk tanks down into Detroit. And so that made quite a change too. And at one time, all of the milk that went to Detroit came from closely surrounding areas, and now a lot of the milk that comes to Detroit comes from Grand Rapids and Lansing or from other areas because of modern roads and transportation. It makes the hauling so much easier than it was 50 or 60 years ago.
I understand that Canton has a lot of underground water, and that has that presented a problem to farmers?
Well, Canton has been known to have a high water table. The land in our area, if you dig down about 30 inches or so, you come to clay, real hard clay, and so it tends to be just like sealing off the topsoil. So if it rains, it's like putting water in a bowl. The water has to evaporate, it can't go down. Some farming areas have gravel soil or sandy soils deeper, and so that makes it's good for getting rid of excess rain, but it also makes more droughty soil if it doesn't rain. So a lot of the farmland in Canton Township was tiled every about 70 feet or so. They would run a drain tile down that would be from 3 to 4 feet deep, so that when it rained a lot, the water tended to seep in these tile and then drain into the creeks. The tile would go down to a main line, and then the main line would drain it into a creek. Otherwise, Canton soils would have been much too wet to have farmed profitably without having had them tiled. But it also makes them less droughty when we do have dry spells in the summertime, so that there's very little irrigation done in this area unless you have a specialized crop as sweet corn, melons, or something that needs water at an exact time in order to ensure a crop that'll be able to sell it because it'll be marketable. When I was old enough to know about the price of farm products, so I was probably lucky if you got $2 or $3 a hundredweight for your milk. And then as time went on, by costs going up and everything, it did get up. So at one time we were getting close to $15 a hundredweight for the milk that was used in bottling. But now with the competition, there's more milk that's needed, and so actually a lot of the farmers are only getting between $12 and $13 a hundredweight for the milk that they're using. So basically, the price hasn't gone up as much. It's just the fact that farmers had to do more per man in order to stay competitive. It isn't the fact that the price keeps going up to help them stay in business, because whether we like it or not, the cost of farming in this area for hiring labor and taxes and many things is much more than if you get in an outstate area. And yet they're getting the same price for their products that we get in this area, and so it's made it so it has, in order to continue in this area, you have to be very competitive and watch costs very closely.
The small farmer has been edged out. And
yes, there's no room. When back, as I said, when my grandfather and father were farming, they had 19 cows, and I can remember many farmers that came to the creamery only set out 1 or 2 cans of milk. That'd only be, or 3, that'd only be 20 or 30 gallons of milk. And whereas now, why, some of these bigger farms are probably shipping 4,000 gallons a day, or some of the bigger ones even more than that. And so it's just was a gradual change, and that's why you see so many abandoned farm buildings. It's not that the buildings weren't useful at the time, but they don't fit into today's agriculture, and you just can't afford to use them. You have to build the pole-type buildings and structures that fit in today's society. And so when you see someone that lets an old barn go downhill and deteriorate, it's just they can't afford to put good money in preserving something that has no use any longer. And that's part of what's changed the community through the years, although there aren't too many barns left unless you get to the southwest corner of Canton Township. And very few of those are used like they once were at one time, because every farm had a few cows and the general farming part of it.
the outbuildings have changed very much.
Oh yes, yeah, because the old type building was a beam type construction, and so you had posts every 16 feet or 20 feet or something, and today is why they build buildings with all clear span, and so you have no poles to use if you want to use a building that doesn't have any poles in it. If you're using it for cattle, why that's not as big a thing, because when we first had one stanchion for each cow, and then as we got more cows, we switched milk. We'd let out some of the cows and bring in others that were stayed outside in a shed. And then it used a lot of straw in order to keep the cows clean when you let them run loose, because they would run in it and with the animal waste and so forth. Why you took a lot of straw each day to keep it dry and clean. And so in about the early 60s, why people went to what they called a free stall. That was an individual stall for each cow, but she was not confined to it. She could come in and lay down, and next time she laid down, she could choose a different stall. The droppings went into an alley, and you were able to scrape them out and keep it clean where they went, and then they could go outside and eat their feed, or some people even feed inside, but we never had done that in the early times. We eventually built feed roofs over all of the feed, because if you get rainy weather like we had the last 2 or 3 days, what's good feed in 2 or 3 hours can turn into a soggy mess, and if cows don't eat it, you don't get any production or growth on them, and so this is part of what you have to do. We went from probably when my brother and I first started farming by ourselves in 1958, maybe let's say we had 90 cows, I'm not sure, and maybe almost that many young stock. Maybe we didn't have quite that many, but the last year or so when I was farming, we had 450 cows, 450 head of young females, and about 300 head of steers or male that we were raising for meat. So we'd gone from maybe 150 total head or 200 to about 1,200. And through the years as we changed our practices of farming.
Is the reason the farmland's disappearing because it's just too expensive for farmers today?
Right. I don't know whether this is important or not, but I know one man sold his property. He got $1,000 an acre, and he didn't get all of his money. They bought it on a kind of, we'll finish paying you off and we'll pay you interest on it. And at the time, he could have probably gone out and bought 3 or 4 acres away from here to replace it. And by waiting until he finally got paid off, why land had gone up. So even you get out in our area, why land sells for $1,200 or $1,400 an acre if a farmer buys it. There's speculators that'll pay more, but the speculators got discouraged about in the mid-70s when Canton's development slowed down because I think there was a recession at the time, and then a speculator told my brother once, the only way we make money is if we buy a piece of property and can turn it over and sell it in 5 years or less. And many of them bought the property and they had payments coming due, and so they let it go back. The farmland near us had been sold once, and then it came back to the owner, and then we bought part of it. And then since then, why Ross Houck has bought the balance of it. But that's the way it is, and as the valuation goes up, why we're going to be faced with the fact that we aren't going to be able to pay the taxes on it eventually, because there's land that's less than a mile from our land. In fact, it's about a half a mile from our land that was sold for $3,500 an acre last year to speculators. They're just holding it in reserve, but they buy it cheap enough so they can hold it in reserve and they can afford to do it. Whereas a farmer doesn't have enough money unless he knows he can dispose of land in just 2 or 3 years. He can subsidize it, but he can't afford to do it over a long-term event. And there's land at the corner of Hanford Road and Ridge Road that's in an estate. It's right next to where housing has been built. The sewer and water's there, and the estate has been offered $15,000 an acre for that land. So it shows why farmers cannot compete with those kind of prices, because there's no way, if farmers outstate can have land that's $1,000 or $800 an acre in paying for it, why just the difference in taxes may make the difference in the profit that's available for them in order to continue farming.
What do you remember best about living and growing up in a community like Canton?
Well, I think today's society with television and rapid transportation and so forth misses a lot, because when my grandfather and grandmother, I grew up and they were still having parties, community. They had a Canton Community Club, and my grandpa and grandma always took me to them, especially in the summertime when they had an ice cream social, and they would have somebody come and speak, or Henry Ford had a Western band that went around, and I remember them coming and being at some of them. They'd have entertainment, and then they'd have ice cream, and it was a kind of a community get-together. So I think at that time with transportation, even before my time, but that's why it originated, these clubs, why people were more socially involved in the church, the school, and community, because there just weren't options available. When I was a boy, why radio was relatively new. I can remember we used to eat lunch in school, and the kids would talk about, I think the Lone Ranger was on, it seemed like it was 2 or 3 nights a week. And so the next day we had to always talk over the half-hour adventure we'd listened to on the radio the night before. And so I think that is one thing that Canton as a community, Canton as a whole community misses now, is the fact that Sheldon had their own little group. Cherry Hill had more or less a church or community group, and other areas in Canton also. And I think now there's not a lot that draws people together, because the children go to different schools, they play on different sporting teams. We go to different churches maybe 7 or 8 miles away, and so basically you don't get to know your next door neighbor and aren't as involved as a community as we used to be. I think Canton is doing a good job by having concerts in the park and their recreation program and so forth. Perhaps is drawing a community together. Why, that's what today's society, the best we can do, probably. But I wouldn't call it the good old days, but at least it was good days when we were living back in those times.